Welcome to the People by People podcast with me, your host, Laura Sutherland. I am back once again with a solo episode. You'll be sick of hearing from me, but all the stuff I have to talk about is of value, it's of importance as well, and I just wanted to chat through last week's launch and release of the PRCA's Misinformation and Climate Strategy Group research results, which was in partnership with Opinium. Thanks Opinium for working with us in that. And the group is, I think, as you already know, something that I am part of, and I helped lead on the research this year. And it was really interesting to get back results and see what had changed since last year. So we did two reports. The first one was the communication and PR industry report, and then the second one was the consumer report. And what I thought I would do was read over some of the highlights for you. I have also recorded a podcast with Paul Sutton on digital download, and I am about to record one in the next probably week or two with an Australian public relations podcast host as well. So stay tuned and I'll be sharing those links with you. But for now, focusing on the PRC's report, 96% of PR professionals advise and help their clients and colleagues to understand the climate crisis and how they can effectively communicate the part they play. Now that was up from 82% last year, which is quite a jump, I think you'll possibly admit. Now, why is there such a jump? Well, I would say possibly because the work that we've been doing in our group to educate the industry and to try and get them to start learning more about the climate crisis and start to understand more about our role and responsibility as PR and communication professionals. Also because COP happened last year in November, and I think it gave people a bit of a wake-up call as to, we should be probably doing something around this. We should maybe, start to think about it a little bit more, about integrating it in our strategies. So I think those are definitely two elements of that. Then 92% say their organisation is taking any measures to address the climate crisis, and that's up from 80% last year, so another increase, which is another positive thing. Why are people taking measures? Probably because, again, there's been more activity, there has been more discussion, there's been more prompting for people to take action rather than just to talk about it. So taking measures to address the climate crisis. Almost all of the participants, so 97%, said that they have taken action to address the climate crisis, and 95% said they'd be willing to take further action. So that is coming back to the challenge to educate themselves, to do professional development, to understand what the climate crisis is, how it happened, where it's going, what the threats are, and what people can do about it. And the fact that 95% said they'd be willing to take further action is brilliant. But now I'm thinking that possibly, what is that further action? And are people waiting to be handheld, spoon-fed, or are they going to take matters into their own hands? I don't know. So that's possibly something for us to have a think about. 45% say that their boss having a better understanding of the importance of addressing the climate crisis would help them prioritise it in relation to their work. So 45% say that their boss having a better understand of it. That kind of says to me that we've got a bit of a problem with the leadership not necessarily understanding the importance of addressing the climate crisis. And again, that could be in-house, it could be agency side, but we need people to understand the importance of addressing the climate crisis so that PR and communication professionals can prioritise it in relation to their work. But I also think that there is definitely a way for us as PR and communication professionals, which we'll come on to push forward with that on the agenda and not just leave it up to leaders, managers, etc. to suggest doing something about it. we'll come back to that shortly. 45% have noticed their clients and organisations attempting to greenwash. So that's quite a lot, but if you flip it around, that is 55% who haven't noticed it, but maybe that's just because they've not been aware of it. 89% of those 45% have pushed back on it, and also 57% rather of the 89% have managed to change the approach as a result. So although those numbers are slightly smaller, it does show that we're growing in more confidence to push back, to challenge, and then change the approach as a result of that challenge. And that's where the conversation comes in about our role as public relations and communication professionals, and just how far we're supposed to go. And it kind of comes back to if we can't show and demonstrate and lead by example, then we don't actually care what we're talking about and care what we're preaching about. And so if we're not measuring our carbon footprint, if we're not, taking alternative transport, if we're not looking for green energy suppliers, etc., then how can we expect those that we're advising to do that and to listen and respect what we have to say? So I think there's two things here. Firstly, it starts at home with you personally, and also then should run through the work that you do. And I think that is where possibly people are coming at it from a different angle. They're going to work and just doing what their companies and stuff are saying and doing, rather than thinking of it from, well, it does start at home, because we're all individuals at the end of the day. It's not computers or technology or anything like that makes up our minds as to how we're going to operate, and decision making as well. So it's important that we take responsibility for that. That sounds very harsh, doesn't it? But it's true. From a consumer perspective, in the Consumer Report, adults in the UK now say that climate crisis is the second most pressing issue. Now, last year it was third, and this year the top one is poverty. 50% believe that the planet faces existential threat due to the man-made crisis, down from 51% last year. But that still says that 50% don't believe that the planet faces existential threat due to the man-made climate crisis. So on one hand, we're saying, 50% believe it, but then 50% don't believe it, which is a huge amount, and that needs changed. Energy is still the top industry leading the way in helping solve the climate crisis. Fashion is still the top industry doing the least. Now, this is obviously from the consumer perspective, and this is what they've said. Although people still don't really know who is doing the least, they still think that fashion is doing the least. 58% say they wouldn't trust information they saw on social media about the climate crisis, which is a high number. TV is still the most watched channel, 82% news and 77% documentaries where people learn or hear about the climate crisis. 46% of social media users have come across a news story on social about the climate crisis that was exaggerated or made up entirely in the last month. 46% in the last month. That's massive. And the research also shows that knowledge of what misinformation and disinformation is still pretty much remains the same as last year, which is pretty low. And I don't know if that's maybe just the terminology because people are wise to it themselves. 7 in 10 say they'd likely stop buying from a brand if they knew it had misled them about environmental impact. And that just shows that people don't like to be lied to. They don't like to be misled. And it also shows that, when journalists or others call out bad practice, unethical activity and lies, then it's going to have some sort of backlash on that brand. 57% of consumers admitted that they don't know the outcome of COP26. A third don't think that the agreements made at the conference really affect them. So I'm thinking to myself, are these significant events not being translated effectively down to the public in a simple language? 55% don't think the UK's done anything differently since COP. So we're not doing enough, we're not doing anything differently, people don't know the outcome of COP, so what's the point? And then that kind of brings us to the point of, do we need these massive, big, fancy conferences, which is basically like a parade, or do we keep those parades to the politicians who want to go there and discuss policy and agree agendas, etc.? Fine, but not make it such a public and consumer-facing interest, because that's not fair to say consumer interest. It is of consumer interest, but the results are the consumer interest, as in what comes out of those conferences and what actions countries and people will be taking. So I think there needs to potentially be like a rethink on how that's coming across and what those how it's impacting and translating across from these massive big conferences, global conferences, like people turning up. It was literally like a who's who in the politics world coming along, some of the brands that were mentioned, but we don't really know what happened in half of those conference rooms or exhibition areas and what the impact was. So it might be fine for the brands that attended and for the lucky people who were allowed to go along, but not for the rest of the world who sat there and watched it all happen. So yeah, interesting. Coming back to something that Paul Sutton and I were talking about earlier in terms of where does it stop? Where does this role stop? And for us as PR and communication professionals, and I said, well, we are in such a privileged position that we are like probably one of the only functions that have that 360-degree view of an organisation, that we are and should be the ones who are pulling together all the different departments and all the different leadership teams, the C-suite, and pulling them together to make sure that there is awareness of what's happening across the organisation in terms of sustainability and in terms of reduction, recycling, reusing, offsetting, etc. And then translating how that impacts people and how that impacts people in the organisation, how it impacts people out with the organisation, for example, the stakeholders. And that kind of comes back to my point about me having developed this synergy framework, which takes into consideration the stakeholder relations, strategic communication, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and measuring and reporting. And those are the four key elements to thinking it through, getting the data, bringing everyone together, taking everyone on that journey and actually making an impact and impacting everyday lives. And it's really, it's kind of one of those situations where people sometimes think that communication, in fact, I was speaking to someone yesterday who said, when I said, well, what about internally, does that brief include internal communication? And they said, oh, well, we have our team meetings. And I kind of thought to myself, is that the extent of what people understand about internal communication? Clearly, it kind of is, and it has been my experience in the last few years that people consider internal communication just to be a tactical thing where you write an email and ping it out to people or have a meeting. Whereas internal communication has to be much more about living those values, about the culture of the business, about being inclusive, about being diverse, and about that outlook of, well, what makes this sustainable for us in the future internally. And that is all about the communication role and about relationships and trust, and that is where we are, that's where we need to be, and that's where we need to be making the impact internally. And then from an external perspective, if you're looking at your stakeholders and their needs, then each individual stakeholder group will likely have their own strategy and have their own plan that you need to focus on, because their needs will be different and it is not a broad brushstroke operation. So that's why I keep stressing with stakeholder relations that it's not just about stakeholder engagement. The engagement part is almost one of the easier parts. There's a lot more to be done before and after engaging. So that's why I talk about integration a lot. And integration, as in we integrate ourselves within the organisation, but also we integrate the function and we integrate the thinking around this bigger idea of sustainability and helping solve real world issues and making an impact on people and the planet at the same time. So that is a whistle-stop tour of the report from the PRC's Misinformation and Climate Strategy Group. John Brown did a really good presentation for us at the PRC's UK conference last week, and it was really good to kind of get the feedback from everybody, and obviously John's usual fabulous style of delivery meant that it was a bit of fun, a bit engaging, a wee bit naughty, but it was hard hitting and it was really to the point. So thank you to everyone in the Misinformation Climate Strategy Group for all their work. Thank you to the PRC for helping support the group to be able to do this and to start rolling out. We need to now focus on these findings and what we do with them as a result, because there's no point in having amazing insight and not doing anything with it. So that'll be the next phase of what we do. We've actually got a meeting this week to catch up on where we're at and to sort of download all that sort of intel and insight from all the stuff we've been doing. If you want to give me a shout or drop me an email to talk about the synergy framework and how that can help you, whether you're an agency that needs that support internally for your own agency or for your clients, or if you're an organisation or a business or a brand who needs support and guidance as to where to start, I'm definitely the woman for it, and I would be delighted to hear from you. It doesn't matter what sector you're in, it doesn't matter the size of your business, the synergy framework is scalable and replicable, so there's massive opportunity and massive scope there, and with all my expertise sort of bringing it all together, I think it's a win-win. As always though, thank you so much for tuning in to the People by People podcast. Please do leave me a review and please do subscribe to the podcast, and I'll speak to you at the next episode. Over and out.